Hi, welcome back again to episode 2 of the OJ's Experience. We are your hosts.
Hi, I'm Owen.
I'm Jim Roach.
And I'm Joey. And this is the OJ's Experience, OJE. Now, on episode 2, last episode we covered Matthew Crawford's Shop Class of Soulcraft in respect to the fact of what is the good life. Today we're going to be looking at a different book for the same class, Ethics, for Dr. Petrocelli. We're going to be looking at Jonathan Lear's Radical Hope, Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation. Specifically talking about the title of the book, Radical Hope. And generally just kind of, what is radical hope? Is it possible? Is it legitimate or is it a good thing? And how does this apply to what we've been talking about all year? How does this apply to the good life? And how does this apply to the everyday world? Because there's a lot of places in the world where people need a lot of hope. So, to start off, we want to talk about, like we said, the possibility and legitimacy. Firstly is the possibility. So, is radical hope possible? In reference to this book centers around Plenty Coup, a chief of the Crow, which was a Native American nation in America while America was occupying the territories, Indian territories. And they were faced with a decision of having to let go of their way of culture or their way of life. And this is specifically why Plenty Coup, Plenty Coup applies very well to this question of radical hope, is they had to let go a lot of their culture. Now, firstly, asking out if you guys want your guys' input on this, just to give your quick responses on what you think radical hope is, and if you think it's possible.
Yeah, I think I definitely think that radical hope is possible, and that it is, it's something that can happen. And in this case, it definitely did. Where the radical part is obviously it's more than just a hope that tomorrow is going to be a good day. It's a hope that you will have a life and you will have some semblance of a culture beyond this year or next year or the next decade. So I definitely think that it is something that's possible, and Plenty Coup definitely showed that you have to think in a very radical, and you do have to hope more than you normally would, because you have to let go of almost everything that you've ever known. Mm-hmm. And the core of your culture, which is the honor and the hunting and the gathering. And when you have to give all of that up, you really have to have a radical hope that you will have something after everything is already left.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, do you have any input on that? Or specifically also, I was wondering as well, talking about this, radical hope he talks about. A lot of people think of it as hope as just hoping things will turn out for the better. And we talked a lot about kind of extremes of this, kind of despair or just too much optimism or stuff like that. How is radical hope different from ordinary hope or just optimism in general?
I think, first of all, I think radical hope is real. Even though in my life I probably don't have radical hope, where I've even gone through an experience like this where events in my life lose meaning and the concepts go away. But I do think it's real, and Plenty Coup definitely has a lot of virtues to be able to have some radical hope. Mm-hmm. But, sorry, remind me what you asked after that.
Oh, yeah, generally, what just makes radical hope different from just general hope or optimism? What makes it radical?
I think it just has to be, you almost don't know what the good is that mm-hmm. is coming that you're hoping for. Mm-hmm. But I remember, if you guys have ever watched, what's it called? Shawshank Redemption.
Oh,
and they're in the it's about a prison movie. I don't know if you've seen it, Dr. Petrocelli, but it's a prison movie, and one of the main characters, Red, he says that hope is a very dangerous thing because they obviously don't think they're going to get out, and they're kind of gloomy. But anyway, one guy definitely does think he's going to get out, but he knows that getting out is good. He can see what is good about that. Whereas radical hope is something where you're still hoping for it, but you don't know what the good is. So I think that's the definition there of the difference.
So I think the best comparison for that, honestly, at least from my interpretation of that, is it's kind of like being stuck at that prison, but you don't know really what's on the outside. Or or just leaving an environment you know for a long time. That's why Plenty Coup is so good for the situation, and why he stands as such a good example of it. Because obviously it's possible. You can be stuck somewhere, or not even stuck somewhere. You can just be in an environment, and then you're forced to leave that environment, or you want to leave that environment, and you don't know what's on the other side. and don't always know if it's better, if it'll be worse, but just having that fortitude and that strength to be able to push across that horizon, and really give context to like what this means and really put our ideals into perspective. It takes a lot of fortitude, it takes a lot of courage. We talked a lot about courage in this book. And yeah, so I think we talked about, and obviously, general, this is all in response to the question of after this, nothing happened. So I think overall, like this meaning of nothing happening or a way of life ceasing to exist, there is a way. We covered that. We've given examples and thought that there is definitely a way to have radical hope and a way to have hope out of this. Now, our second part of this question is its legitimacy. Obviously, having hope, most people consider hope to be a good thing, and some people also consider it to be delusional, like having too much hope or being too optimistic. So certain things like that. Do either of you guys have any points or any things you want to talk about the legitimacy or the virtue of radical hope?
Yeah, I'd say that, and Lear also mentioned this, there is virtue that was exhibited by Plenty Coup in this radical hope where I think he mainly touched on courage and how Plenty Coup, who was the leader of the Crow Nation at the time, he had the difficult decision of what he was going to do because he had to lead his people, and their typical ways of courage and showing strength were completely opposite from retreating from a way of life or retreating from a battle. So I would say that it legitimately is something that requires a lot of virtue and particularly a lot of courage, because he was definitely looked down upon by a lot of the people that he governed, and by making the decision to move forward and not just fight it out and fight the U.S. government in which they would lose, he understood enough to know that they would lose and that they already lost their hunting and some of their other ways of life, and most other Indian nations had either lost completely, they had just completely been wiped out, or they 100% took on the American way of life. And I would say Plenty Coup, he sort of melded the two together where they didn't have to give everything up, but they could slowly work into it and see what was truly on the other side. So the virtue and the courage that it took for him to lead his people into something which they had never even thought of before. They'd never thought of retreating from something or losing any part of their way of life, which had been grounded in them for their entire life. That was the aspect of virtue that I really noticed in the radical hope of Plenty Coup.
Yeah, and I definitely see that as well, especially kind of just being courageous. Like, we talk about being courageous, but in a way that seems more cowardly to these people. It's like kind of, how do you be courageous when your definition of courage is kind of dying? Like we talked about, for the counting coup specifically, like acts like that, counting coup, or like other things that were considered courageous in their day, like hunting like buffalo or stuff like that, or like fighting against. Like obviously they lived a very good life. All they did was they hunted water buffalo. They had disputes with other nations and other tribes. And this is what they thought of as courageous, because they generally were on pretty equal level with like these other tribes. And if you did die for this, it's like, oh, you died for a greater cause. You died for your tribe. But with the U.S. government coming in, you're kind of dying for nothing because your tribe kind of has no hope or no future. With these other tribes, if you went out and fought another tribe, you died, counting coup, you died fighting for your tribe and you died for something. Versus if you went out and died against the U.S. government, you're just going out and they're dying and being reckless when you're not really going to help your tribe, when your tribe is going to collapse either way. So this kind of cowardice courage emerges where it's like you said, like courage through retreating, courage through knowing when to just enter the unknown and stuff like that. Owen, did you have any points on this or any quotes or anything?
Yeah, when you said dying for nothing against the U.S. government, that just reminds me of what was the example in class where he was like fighting like sheep or like ladders or something?
The one dude.
What did we say?
Wait, who was that?
It was like,
I can pull that for you.
Oh, yeah, Don Quixote when he was...
The fight in the windmills?
Windmills, that's what it was.
Yeah.
And so like fighting windmills, like, I mean, that doesn't really make you courageous or anything, but like if you go fight like another tribe to like defend your people or whatever. Like the people are gonna have.
Yeah, and the sheep one was
respect for you.
Ajax. That was Ajax. It was
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, kind of just the pointlessness of just being reckless and that kind of stuff. So, yeah, it makes sense. I think we covered a lot of legitimacy and possibility for that. So we kind of established the possibility of radical hope, especially in the face of death of culture, death of a way of life, as well as we're talking about the legitimacy and its virtues, because as we talked about, it's definitely a good response to this, and we think that it's probably the best way to answer. Specifically on, this kind of spectrum, we were talking about cowardice and recklessness, and as well as despair and presumption that we talked about in class. This is kind of off topic, but I kind of want to talk about the dreams with you guys, and what you guys kind of thought of the dreams that he had, specifically the ones about like kind of the water buffalo and the cattle and stuff like that. You guys got anything for that?
Yeah, not as much on the water buffalo or the buffalo or the cattle, although that was important. I primarily took note of the chickadee, where he had the dream of the chickadee and the I guess the resemblance of how the chickadee acts in the way that it relates to radical hope, where he had the dream and then he realized the significance of the chickadee and that it is sort of a signifier of being humble and being able to wait and notice changes and learn from those and change the way of life. And this is the bird that learns how to change what it does to survive and to thrive. And I think it's a good representation, and it's a good example because, of course, this is mid to late 1800s. I would say people were more animals then than they are now. Yeah. And they were a nomadic people. So they moved around, but they were grounded enough that they didn't want to lose the ground that they had taken. So it's kind of counterintuitive to a degree, but by taking some wisdom from the chickadee dream that he had, he was able to realize, hey, things are changing that we can't fight. We can't fight some of these things, especially the U.S. government. Yeah. We have no means to do that. And by changing the course of how they live their lives, rather than going out dying, they're able to adapt and use some of the new possibilities and slowly lose certain aspects, but they can remain courageous and keep that aspect of their daily life and their basically the backing of their tribe. In doing so, I think it's just hard for them, and especially Sitting Bull, to realize that there was any courage in giving up their way of life whatsoever. Yeah,
I agree with that, especially on the animal part. The animal part really struck me because that's kind of a thing that separates us, especially from animals, is radical hope, I think, and shows us how radical hope is possible and how it exists, is that animals, when they're forced in situations like this, their instincts just tell them to move on. Like, if it was an animal in this position where they're faced with something difficult at all, then their automatic response is to retreat. It's not because they're attached to it or anything like that. They just know for the better. For Plenty Coup and his tribe, it was so difficult to let this go is because there was such cultural significance to counting coup, to being courageous, to not submitting, that kind of stuff. Well, for animals, that's an instinct. That's a really difficult thing for humans to let go of cultural stuff, and it shows why we're more human and shows why radical hope is actually such a virtuous thing and why it applies to humans so well, is because it's this thing that exists in us that doesn't exist in animals. And that's what gives it a lot more meaning for humans. So moving on past this part, we kind of gotten past the preface and introducing and talking about radical hope. What next for just kind of talking about application of this again to the bigger picture of our class. And first off, I think we're going to take a quick break. We're going to have one more commercial break like we had last time, you guys will hear. So stick around for that, and we will get back to the second part of it, where we will be talking about the bigger applications of this question and how it fits into our greater lives.
Get more out of summer with more from the Home Depot. With ways to save on every idea you have, you can do more for your family traditions and even invent some new ones. with 4th of July savings to help you do even more. We can all make this a summer to remember. The Home Depot. How doers get more done.
Thank you to our sponsor, and welcome back to the second part of our discussion on Jonathan Lear's Radical Hope. Now, we finished our last segment up with talking about the possibility and legitimacy of radical hope, and just talking about how does it exist, and is it a good thing? And I think we did a pretty good job at recapping that. We all gave our own personal stories about it and our personal testimonies. Now we want to move on to the more meat of this podcast, which is more about how does this apply to the bigger picture? How does this apply to living well? And how can this apply to our personal lives, the world in general, or even bigger picture if we can find a way for that? So firstly, Owen, do you have any personal experience or any personal testimony or anything you have with radical hope and living well?
Yeah, recently actually, I'll start with this. All my life, like I've loved sports, like playing like any sport that I can, like just being athletic, being outside. And then when I got to college, like I really got involved with like intramurals and just like UBA and BUSA and all that. And so then I went to Italy and I tried to play as many sports as I could over there, but I was just missing like playing intramurals back home. And so when I got back to campus, I was really excited to like start playing basketball with like, you know, kids my age and stuff like that, and like soccer too, because that's what I really find fun. And then I played one basketball game and then half of a soccer game, and that's when I hurt my knee. I tore my ACL, which basically takes you out for like a long time. And so after that, it was kind of like my concept of sports was like gone, because the rehab for an ACL is about almost a year. And so I kind of relate that, not fully obviously because I still have my life in order, but I kind of relate that to what happened to the Coup tribe, and just like having some hope that although I can't play sports anymore, like there's still good that I can do in my life. And so sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
And so in my life, it was a really hard time for me just because I couldn't play sports anymore, and I just knew that there was a long road ahead of recovery and stuff. And so I really had to I couldn't understand why it happened to me, because I mean, it's just probably the way it happens. But looking toward the future, I just had to realize that there's still good that can come out of this, even though I can't fully grasp it. And so I would say I had small bits of radical hope with this whole process. But it's also, in terms of us being Catholic college students, I feel like it's also like radical trust in God, because we have a more wider view of God than Plenty Coup did. And so we can, spend time with him and just try to pray and just get some, secure, like being secure for the future, that it's all going to work out and God has a plan for us. So I would say that's it. That's probably my experience with radical hope in my life. Jim, do you have anything on that?
Yeah, I would say this isn't necessarily something that's actively happening, but for me, the radical hope is just sort of the thought of marriage and starting a family. Obviously, you don't really know what that's going to look like for you, and you're going to have to give up a lot of things for a while, and you don't know if you'll ever get those back. Like for me, and for most of the guys that I know, there's a lot of freedom. They can just mess around, hang out with the boys, and make decisions that they otherwise could not make if they had a family to care for. And not that taking responsibility is something that I fear. I think it's just the unknowing of what kind of responsibilities and what life is going to look like once you start having children. And I think the hardest part is just committing yourself for your entire life to something that you don't know yet, and to somebody that you don't know for sure yet if they're 100% the person that you're going to be with for your whole life. And I think the idea of a family is awesome, but you definitely go into it not knowing a whole lot. Like till death do you part through health and in illness. So you don't know if you're going to be, a couple of years down the line and you get seriously ill and your wife's pregnant and you got kids on the way and you still need to work and you got to push through all those things, and you're going to be losing freedom, and that's kind of scary. You're going to be gaining so much more, but you don't really know what that is yet because you haven't felt. And that sort of goes back to the point where he made about us being finite erotic creatures, where we have a set life, we can't live forever, and we love. And that's the whole point of marriage and having a family, is the love and being able to have that and, get your children to grow up, and then you're going to die someday. But when you go into marriage and start having children, my fear is just, you don't know what's going to happen. You could give birth to a child with a disability, and that will be another hard part in life. Not that it wouldn't be a blessing, but it's just one more thing that you really don't know about, and you don't know how you're going to respond and how you're going to deal with that. So I think that's probably one of the biggest things that I could relate to Radical Hope, where building a family, starting a family, it's obviously a good thing, but you're going to have to give up so much of your current way of life, whether it's good or bad, and move forward with something that's so much more important, but you just don't know what it's going to look like. And legitimately, I think I would be afraid when I'm starting a family. I would be afraid for my kids to get sick, or for my wife to die, or something like that, where I'd have no control or I lose control. And so I think that's probably the biggest part that I was able to relate Radical Hope to.
Yeah, definitely Radical Hope can help you guide through those situations, those difficult times, like stuff like that. And I can help us from overthinking. Like we talked a lot about anxiety and being anxious, and it's kind of like fear without an object, like having anxiety of obviously having anxiety of, oh, what if in 20 years I have a wife and kids and then my wife dies, like anxiety like that. It's kind of what we talk about, like the fear without an object. And how courage is more fear in the face of something like this, how we know that if we were encountered with this situation, we know we have radical hope and we know how we can advance forward from that. And also, Owen, with your point, I want to comment on this earlier, but kind of especially with your physical injuries, stuff like that, stuff for that, like the crow, like they kind of just consider stuff like that as just, that's the end all be all. Like if they couldn't hunt, if they couldn't count coup, if they couldn't do the things that it's meant to be a crow, like physically, if they were physically enabled from doing that, then they just consider their lives were pointless. So finding a new way of life through that for you, but especially for something like that for them, that'd even be a bigger thing. That would be even a bigger loss for them, and still finding a way with Radical Hope through that. My personal experience I want to talk about more was more about kind of my current situation more, which I kind of want to talk about with Radical Hope in the face of loss of maybe financial hope. Specifically for a college student, a lot of college students here and a lot of college students across the country. I think a lot of us could use Radical Hope, especially with student loan debt, stuff like that. The way the world is today, a lot of students are kind of at a loss of hope or in despair or anxiety because of the way that college is set up with student loans, people taking out loans and kind of having no hope. It's like, oh, will I be able to get a job with all the debt I have? Will this all be able to work out? That's kind of what college is. There's definitely cases I feel like in which where it is kind of predatory and where students really are placed in a place of despair, where you might go to a 4-year degree to college and you might not have a job afterwards, and you're kind of stuck in a position where you have a lot of debt from a degree that isn't going to help you. And I found myself worried about this sometimes. It's like, what if I can't find a place to work after college? What if that isn't going to work out for me? And I've kind of seen it as this way of letting go. Like you kind of talk about letting go of a way of life. Debt may not always be the best example of this, but in the proper context, I think it is. Where if it is if you view it as a healthy investment, and you don't go to a place that's too expensive or that would become too much debt for you to handle. Stuff like this, taking on student loan debt, stuff like that for an education, for the possibility afterwards. Like going into college, you have an idea of what you want to do sometimes. But in general, you don't know what's going to be at the end of the tunnel. You don't know what's going to be after graduation. I have a better idea personally myself. I don't know about you guys, but I have a better idea myself of what I want to do next year now than I did 2 years ago. But there's still a lot of uncertainty. And going into college, you're being asked, hey, take out this much debt, take out this amount of money, and just absolutely give up a lot of your financial freedom. in hopes of finding a career or a life at the other end of that tunnel, at the other end of college. And so I find radical hope, I find radical hope applied very well in this situation, because you're going into this, you're giving up a lot of what you know. And he kind of talks about it in the book. One of the quotes that I really liked a lot was on page 92. He talks in reference to another author we talked about this semester, Soren Kierkegaard. So he says in the middle of page 92, one needed some conception of, or commitment to, a goodness that transcended one's current understanding of the good. Kierkegaard coined the phrase teleological suspension of the ethical to describe Abraham's response to God's alleged command that he sacrifice his son. The ethical requirement to nurture one's children is to be suspended in light of the higher call. So yeah, this kind of nurturing children, being called to a higher call that Kierkegaard talks about, applies very well to Plenty Coup. And just, accepting that there's something greater, something beyond our horizon, something that we can't understand yet. That's about what I had for the financial freedoms. Also, again, just like going to college in general, not just the financial part, is generally letting go of something. Like you are sitting, he kind of talks about this with Kierkegaard, where he talk about kind of climbing a summit and going to renouncing what you know on the material world. So that can be like when we're teenagers, that could be our high school, our family, stuff like that. You're renouncing it and then receiving a new understanding while we're at college. And then we're applying that and bringing it back to the world that we knew before. So obviously, like, we're going from our known world, renouncing that and going to somewhere unknown, that being college, taking what we know there and bringing it back to the known world again. When we have careers, whether that be starting a family and things like that. So that's kind of the teleological suspension of the ethical in regards to what I thought applying to college as well as applying to radical hope. So kind of just some other questions to wrap it up. We kind of want to talk about some other things to wrap up these last 2 minutes. I want to ask you guys, what do you think about, do you think guys think that radical hope could be misused or interpreted in a dangerous way? Maybe accepting just injustice too passively or being too reckless with hope, and how do you guys think we can guard against that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, just in our life, I feel like radical hope isn't very easy to come by. I feel like it's pretty rare. And so misusing it would definitely be tough, because if you have that much trust in the future and you know that good's coming, I feel like misusing it would be hard. But I think it's maybe possible if you have just absolutely unrealistic expectations of the future. But also, it's not really expectations of the future. It's more just like, I don't understand the future. So I think there's an interesting line there where you could maybe not understand it, but it's also unrealistic. So I think it could be misused if it's in the wrong context. I don't know what the context of that would exactly be, but I think it's possible. Jim, do you have anything on that? I feel like I might think more on this.
Yeah, I think part of the radical hope, I mean, as far as can it be misused, Plenty Coup obviously was using radical hope properly, and his the main person that opposed him was Sitting Bull, saying that he was a coward. And although we sort of determined in class that Plenty Coup wasn't a coward, that sort of brings up the scale of sort of coward and courage. And then I think a better scale in this case would be between despair and presumption. So I guess I don't know if radical hope can be misused necessarily, because it's fairly strict in what it is, and it's radical in its hope rather than just being presumption. Where I think if we wanted to sort of compare it to something that was being misused, I would say presumption, where you think you know what's going to happen and you're falsely confident about that. So I don't know if there's a way to necessarily misuse radical hope. I think it's just more shifting from the center of the line between your presumption and your despair, where radical hope's in the middle, and you start shifting a little bit too far towards presumption, and you think you know what's going to happen. Whereas with radical hope, you have to give something up, and you have to have that courage, rather than just being, unknowing but having a little bit too much ego and thinking you know what's going to happen.
Yeah, Jim, I think that reminds me of when we talked about fear and anxiety. Like anxiety is, or I forget what it was. Yeah, what I was just going to say is that line I was talking about earlier, I just thought of this, but like we talked about the fear in the face of anxiety is kind of like fear without an object. And that kind of just, in my mind, it works like radical hope. You don't know what's coming, but you're still hopeful. And that's kind of like anxiety, like you're fearful of something that you don't know is there. Whereas fear and presumption are like you kind of have a sense of what's coming, or you might think you know what's going to happen. So I think that line there is similar in the way that you distinguish the feeling. So.
Yeah. And I think that all comes back down to, honestly, all that kind of comes back into being in touch with reality. Like we talked about like Sitting Bull, what we talked about with what you're talking about with Owen with anxiety. It's kind of being in touch with the reality, and that's kind of what Sitting Bull lacked. Sitting Bull lacked this touch with reality. He thought that things were going to work out his way because it kind of with the dreams is like, especially with the dreams, because he had similar dreams to Plenty Coup we talked about, where it's like his dreams more he thought of as the good is going to come out no matter what, versus Plenty Coup is they had to let go of what they knew, and he had to be realistic about that. And again, kind of like this is kind of what we wrapped off is like understanding that we are finite beings. This is kind of how we wrapped up the last day of talking about this. Is why it's a virtue is because of the fact that we are, as we call it, finite erotic beings. And so knowing that our grasp of the good is not always equal to the good, and so being in touch with reality, but also knowing what our ideals are, but also still being in touch with reality. Like we said, Sitting Bull lacked this. He was not in touch with reality. He thought that things were going to work out their way. And that's why they continue with their dance and their rituals, and they faced persecution for it, and they ended up ultimately all dying because of it. So we need to understand this finite part of us and being in touch with reality so that we can use radical hope in our lives to live a good life. So yeah, what we talked about all semester, living the good life. How does radical hope apply to this? My personal interpretation was that it kind of calls back to what kind of beings we are. Again, we are finite erotic beings who don't always understand what the good is. And like one of the things about living the good life is having a constant understanding of understanding that we aren't always going to understand what the good life is. And that's a continual thing that's going to continue for the rest of our lives. It's learning what the good life is. Radical hope gives us a sense of trusting in this and learning constantly and learning throughout our lives what the good life is. And radical hope gives us hope in the sense that we can let go and understand this higher truth or higher good. So do you guys have any closing remarks relating to that?
Yeah, so I guess one thing that stood out to me is where we talked about how my grasp of the good does not equal the good, actually, because, you know, your grasp is something that's sort of a snapshot in time, and the actual good is something that, as Joey said, it's something that you are still sort of striving towards, even though you don't fully know what it is. And I think that definitely is well related to Plenty Coup because, you know, they understood and they had a grasp of what was good, but they didn't fully know what it was. And he was smart enough and courageous enough to understand that and know that where they were, and if he were to make the decision to just go out fighting and lose his life along with his people and their, you know, basically rather than just lose a way of life that they once knew, he would end up losing everything. Everybody would be gone. So I think just knowing that you don't know everything, I think that definitely works into sort of living the good life. And the way this is sort of related to that is just understanding that his grasp of the good wasn't actually the good because it was going to change. And that's the same thing with the good life. It changes and it progresses, and you can never fully know exactly what it is until you're on that path and you're still moving along.
I would say for having radical hope in our lives, it would definitely give us more virtues if we had radical hope. And what we talked about with Aristotle, like collecting virtues, I kind of think about it as like Thanos, like collecting virtues in your life. I don't know why, but if we can like get as many virtues as we can as humans, then we are living the good life. And if we had radical hope, we would definitely be able to do that through, like, courage is a huge part of radical hope, just because it takes a lot of bravery to go through something like that and still believe that you're going to come out all right. And another side of that is just some humility, because you don't really know what's next for you. And that definitely, you got to be humble to do something like that. And even though you can't picture the future, there's still good out there that's coming.
Sweet. Awesome. Well, thanks again, guys, for coming in for this last podcast. It's been a great semester. I love these 2 episodes we've done. Once again, that's the OJ's experience. Owen, James, and Joey. I almost messed it up again. Didn't mess it up this time. But, yeah, thanks again, guys. It was a great talk. For all you guys out there, all you listeners out there, keep hoping radically and keep living the good life.
Peace.
Please subscribe.